A much invigorated our programme, and we're very pleased that she came and that others came, Godric and so on. So, Alyson was at Queen's University Belfast before she came here, about 3 years, wasn't it, Alyson?
4, yeah.
4? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And before that she was at Melbourne Uni. So, without further ado, Alyson's going to talk about From Bogeyman to Bison, a herd-like amnesia of HIV, AIDS.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much for coming and thank you for putting out with the kind of technological and debacle. That seems to be kind of the story of my life at the moment, but we shall move on from it. Hopefully it will be fine. So basically today I'm going to focus on the paper that the title alludes to, which is now a published article, so I sort of feel a bit weird reading it. It feels like it's done. But I'll try to frame it a little bit in terms of the bigger project. So essentially at Queen's Uni in Belfast, as I'll go through in here, there was a particular reason why I decided to stage an Australian play, played by a playwright from Sydney called Marlon, and it was played about gay male sexualities. And in the end, so it ended up a massive project which has produced 2 very different articles. The other article was called Translating Gay Time, and it's actually just come out this week in Australasian Drama Studies, and that's very much a cultural translation and questioning the idea of a global gayness in that sense of sort of queer critical geographers really kind of questioned the idea of a global gay identity. And so I was trying to show that the play being placed in Belfast, taking the Sydney play and placing it there, had kind of demonstrated that it was to do with space and place, and that gay identity is not the same everywhere, even though there's a kind of homogenous image of the happy gay identity that we get sold. So, and I suppose the other thing is that Lachlan and I, the playwright, and I've been working together since 2000 when we actually did the initial and original version of this play in Melbourne, and we've managed to somehow keep going with our kind of loose collaboration project or PRODS. Which, as somebody in Northern Ireland pointed out to me, had quite a different connotation when it was put into the Catholic Protestant, the party mixed there. But so, and you know, I think that that's quite an issue in terms of staging the play in Northern Ireland. So that was quite a key part of this, given that Northern Ireland is particularly sort of regional, rural, conservative, religious, vaguely troubled as well. So what happened was that there was a single catalyst that was the start of all of this, so the production and the 2 articles that emerged from it, and that is lovely Iris. So I shall kick off. In June 2008, Iris Robinson MP, Democratic Unionist Party member and wife of Northern Ireland's First Minister, caused controversy when she stated in a radio interview that homosexuality was an abomination that left her feeling physically nauseous. She extolled the virtues of the ex-gay mission as follows: I have a very lovely psychiatrist who works with me in my offices, and his Christian background is he tries to help homosexuals trying to turn away from what they are engaged in. And I have met people who have turned around to become heterosexual. So I start with Mrs. Robinson then, because that's where the decision to stage Bison in Belfast started for me. And when she made those comments, there was a sort of massive galvanising of the whole LGBTQ community. And so I kind of wanted to, I was furious actually, was what happened. And so I wanted to respond in some way, and the most obvious way for me was to make a theatre production. But because I was then newly ensconced in the university, and I suppose one thing that's interesting was that I grew up in Northern Ireland and I ran away essentially at 18, just went, oh, enough of that. And it was so interesting to go back to Queen's and then go, I'm in the middle of this, you know, the place of learning in Northern Ireland, and I can do this. And so we had a one-day conference that sat alongside the production then. So there was a program that I started, a research and performance program called Queer at Queen's. It was only waiting to happen. Why nobody had done it, I don't know. But the Queers at Queen's started off really with this, and I think actually it was the first time in Ireland that we'd had a day looking at kind of queer identities in Northern Ireland. So that was, I'd have to say that Queen's would not put the full title of that conference up on the website at any point. It was performing queer subjectivities, and the word queer took quite a long time. And several emails, several phone calls, and a definition of queer theory. PhD Mrs. Robinson, far too political, that thing. So it was The sense of outrage that provoked me into bringing Philpott's play about contemporary gay male sexualities to Ulster, a term I use in inverted commas, obviously, because it includes a whole set of socio-historical and political connotations connected to unionism and the zealously guarded integrity, and you can read the integrity in any sort of corporeal way you want, of an evangelical Presbyterianism that has been marked historically by such campaigns as Ulster Says No and Save Ulster from Sodomy. And that was Belfast Pride 2010. So, so I'll move on. So that's kind of the background really for where this has come from. And I don't sound nearly as angry in this one as I did to begin with. The other one actually I still do. So, back to this then. In 2000, David Roman wrote an article, Not About AIDS, which was published in GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. And referencing two dance pieces, the article details the decline in representations of HIV/AIDS in performance and a simultaneous move towards marriage and military as the twin foci of LGBT representation in the US. While the Don't Ask, Don't Tell specific policy is specific to the US, the more transnational focus of LGBT rights organisations on marriage and the family over the past 15 years, certainly with regard to the UK, Australia and the States, which I guess is the area I'm dealing with, can be seen to epitomise what Lisa Duggan has called the new homonormativity, and she describes that as a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them. As Julian Carter notes, most critiques of homonormativity draw attention to its relationship with neoliberal politics. For example, queer/crip theorist Robert McRuer, whose work draws connections between queer theory and disability studies, uses the framework of neoliberalism to describe our contemporary moment as a normalizing historical period that insistently domesticates disruptive queer forces. The political strategy of normalizing lesbian and gay life according to mainstream or heteronormative values is decidedly a move away from the queer strategies of the 1980s and early 1990s that, as Michael Warner has elucidated, set out to expose and challenge the institutions and discourses of heteronormativity precisely through what he calls resistances to the normal. Instead, an embrace of the homonormative results in what Warner identifies as a new hierarchy of good gays and bad queers, the former of which are notably white, monogamous, gender-conforming and middle class. To this I would add the able-bodied and healthy. As a strategy then, it includes the non-white, the financially dependent, the sick, the disabled, and those whose sexualities fall outside the framework of gay goodness. This hierarchy clearly has ramifications for which gay subjectivities are celebrated through representation and which are hidden away. Over the past decade since Roman's article, this normalization process has been reflected in mainstream media representation that aims to show, above all, how normal gays are. The most obvious examples include television's Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, the L Word, Ellen/Ellen and her marriage to Portia de Rossi, and most recently the film The Kids Are All Right, and totally normal, by the way. But the routinized visibility of the good gay lifestyle is problematic because, as Dana Collins argues, despite the intervention that positive images of marginalized subjectivities can make, she says, liberatory and representational models still reproduce the key dichotomies of positive and negative representations, silenced and liberated sexualities, and fantasy and real life. The emphasis on visibility implies that the reality of gay life is positive, or at least coherent enough to be represented, which presents a dilemma for those who intentionally use representation politically. The desire to challenge negative images of LGBT experience, therefore, brings with it a homogenizing and sanitizing visibility that seeks to hide away bad gay lifestyles. So picking up from this context and set of queer theories, I argue that a dangerous but logical result of this fetish of normativity, to use Philip Clapper's term, is the distancing of HIV/AIDS from LGBT representation. Needless to say, HIV/AIDS subjectivities are problematic for the project of homonormativity. While the strategy of breaking an assumed link between gay people and HIV/AIDS has been vital and at times urgent, a byproduct created by what Cindy Patton has called the de-gaying of this is a diminished attention to the continued presence of HIV/AIDS in the gay community. This lack of focus produces an amnesia which can be identified not only in representational practices, but that can be seen to sideline or conveniently forget about HIV/AIDS, but also in what Gregory Thompson argues has been a general decline in scholarly attention to HIV/AIDS in the humanities in general. Thompson insists that despite the apparent normalisation of HIV/AIDS in contemporary Western societies, the need for an invigorated response to the pandemic is grave. So, while situated amongst a wide field of queer contestations of homonormativity, then, this paper responds most directly to Roman's 2000 and Thomas's 2010 articles, and focuses on two particular examples of HIV/AIDS in theatre performance. The choice of performances emerges from an unexpected symmetry to my work as a director. One of the earliest jobs I had was as assistant director to avant-garde queer auteur Reza Abdo. On his play Bogeyman at the Los Angeles Theatre Centre in 1991, and then recently Bison for Belfast's Outburst Queer Arts Festival in 2009 and the Opal House Theatre London in 2010. So despite very different dramaturgies, working methods and historical contexts, there's a thematic and political connection that unites the work, as both plays respond to the occurrence and experience of HIV/AIDS amongst gay men at their particular social moment. Yet while Abdo's play emerged at the height of AIDS activism, its representation on stage and the public discussion of this representation, Philpott's play goes against the grain by trying to reinsert HIV/AIDS into what has been called the post-AIDS economy. Working from the material situations in which these productions took place, it's inevitably partial and personal. Its emphasis is on the US, Northern Ireland and Australia because that's where plays were produced or written. But from a somewhat alienatory starting point, the paper draws some parallels in the dramaturgy of the two pieces, despite their different contexts. Crucially, both locate their politics not in the dramatic dialogues of realism, often held up, certainly in British critical practices, as the epitome of political theatre, but in idiosyncratic queer dramaturgies that often work affectively rather than immediately cognitively. Through analysis of the affective and experiential impact of Abdo and Philpott's dramaturgical strategies, I argue ultimately that along with the continued need for the representation of HIV/AIDS subjectivities on the contemporary Western stage, there needs to be a continual reimagining of a queer dramaturgy that can find forms to reflect the complexities of these subjectivities. There's a bit of a chronology that's going on then, and there's a moment that is about AIDS that Bogeyman sits in. And working on Bogeyman at LATC, the social context was one of paranoia and the labelling of HIV/AIDS as gay plague. Public advertisements at the time ranged from terrifying images of grim reapers and the suggestion that unsafe sex, and this meant sex without a condom, would almost certainly be lethal. And then it ranged to gay activist campaigns trying to counteract this hysterical homophobia that had emerged through this discourse. And now I'm going to put all that faffing is about, because hopefully we will be able to look at this, except I don't know how to open this. Will this come out to the
Hold control.
Do what?
Control.
Control.
Oh, right, okay. Gonna work? No. After all of this. No? Shall I give up? Yeah. Do you think there's anybody? Do you want to give it a go? And if not, we'll just move on without it. It's just, this is such a great ad. This is an ad from the Australian campaign. I think it's from the late 80s. And is it going to work? Doesn't want to work?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's going to work, is it?
Yeah.
And it's very, well, I won't preempt your reactions to it actually, but all I can say is that my partner and Lachlan are exactly the same age, and they're very, thank you.
I remember this from Australia. I remember the British one. Yeah, the British one.
But now we know every one of us will be devastated by it. The fact is, over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead. That if not stopped, it could kill more Australians than World War II. But AIDS can be stopped, and you can help stop it. If you have sex, have just one safe partner, But always use condoms. Always.
So I'm glad. I'm sorry it took so much laughing, but I think it's worth showing because we are. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. You know, we're so influenced by those, and I think Sue, you sort of saying, "Oh, I remember this," and certainly that is the the environment that Lachlan, the playwright of Bison, remembers very, very clearly. As you know, and I remember the Grim Reaper type ads, and certainly I remember being in Los Angeles in 1990. With huge billboards, you know, going don't discriminate, and you know, massive campaigns having to deal with all this stuff. So that was the environment, and a lot of terror as well. So the immediate context in the theatre was that Reza was HIV positive, as was one of the cast. And Bogeyman, I would say, was partly born out of Reza's rage at his own HIV positive status, but also at the social and medical discursive construction of this disease as punishment on the immoral bad gays. Structured predominantly through fragmentation and montage, there is a multiplicity of overlapping narrative forces. Going through my rehearsal script, a messy, literally cut up and pasted, almost impossible to work my way through document, and given that I was the one probably trying to keep track of it, that doesn't bode very well, does it? But Reza would come in every day with new bits of writing and change things, and so actually keeping track of the text was huge. But going through it again, I was seeing that narrative themes were really clear. The idea of being tested, the pervasion of illness, of pill popping, of corporal punishment by the state in a branding of butts, of committing suicide or trying to, and the dysfunctional all-American family really metonymically for the American state or states. This is nominally and tenuously held together by the plot of a terrorist, Hilda's over there actually, played by Tom Cole, who aims to blow up the Central Committee in response to their failure to provide drugs to his sick lover Blake. However, the narrative strands are only one single element in terms of the dramaturgy. Experiencing it in the theatre, the piece was a massive, multi-layered technological juggernaut, a 90-minute relentless visual and oral attack on the body and senses played at a furious pace. And I'll show you some of it. So it had a structure of 5 acts, a prologue and an epilogue set on Mars. This is the epilogue set on Mars. Staged with 11 actors and a cellist. It took place on a stage that required the main stage of the Los Angeles Theatre Center to be ripped out to make room for a 3-story tenement building with 9 separate rooms, including one with working shower. And Reza used to pace around at the back of the auditorium, actually just urging them, waving his arms frantically at the actors to go faster and faster. The day we moved onto the set and moved from this horizontal flat space of the rehearsal room and into this suddenly this 3-story thing, he wanted them to go full pace. So we had one to the hospital that day, I think. So Julianne Francis, the one female performer in there, and then Cliff as well ended up in the hospital. So Cliff, oh no, he's not the one hanging. Oh, yeah, maybe he's the one hanging upside down in there. I said Tony Torn, Fiona and I were talking about Tony Torn the other day. Tony's up on the top of torturer, but frenetic, absolutely frenetic, and pace was everything. And they were all mic'd and just barrage of noise, image. There was a videographer and videos showed in that kind of central piece as well. So just tons going on all at once. Daniel Muffson notes that in Abdo's stage work, and these pictures are from Daniel Muffson's book, Rosa Abdo. He notes that there's extensive use of horizontal or sequential montage and vertical or simultaneous montage. He explains the latter as scenes and actions that remain separated spatially yet comment on one another in their simultaneity. While he equates verticality with simultaneity, this verticality clearly was realised literally as well, the extravagance of Bogeyman's set. Its density, dizzying speed and deafening volume produced an overwhelming effective intensity. Despite the apparent counterintuitiveness of this, it's the density and experiential intensity that makes Abdo's work so politically effective, I think. While critics complained of overload to the point of meaningless, for example, Michael Feingold on Typewriter White, none of it makes sense, and the absence of any context from Abdo's work is its most alarming element. It is precisely Abdo's experiential or affective dramaturgy that is crucial to its social political efficacy in intervening in discourses of HIV/AIDS, or in Typewriter White it was about racism. As I've argued in terms of Sarah Kane's late work, An effective dramaturgy relies more on what theatre feels like than what it signifies on a cognitive level, certainly immediately, and is committed to producing its own play world rather than sitting in a referential and implicitly inferior position to a world outside. As Sylvie Drake notes in her review of Minamata, this event is to be experienced. It compels attention by hurling images and sounds at its audience like an automatic tennis server gone berserk. Leitmotiv's counterpoint and eclecticism are keys to Abdo's staggering creation. It is not without meaning ultimately, but that meaning may not immediately be obvious during the experience of the performance, where various strategies, in his case, well, as I said, multiplicity of narrative, sound and visuals, point of overload, work to resist an easy interpretation. As affect theorist Brian Massumi has argued, however, it is the strength, or what he calls the intensity of the image, let's say the non-signifying image, that ultimately affects how meaning is made. The embodied affective impact does not remain outside of the signification loop, but eventually becomes meaningful as the mind consciously qualifies, and that's Massumi's word, the mind qualifies the effect of the image retrospectively in what he calls a backward referral in time. Thus, while reviews and analysis of Abdo's work highlight the sensory overload, the most astute recognise that he has not set out to obfuscate or make a meaningless theatre, but one that works in a particular way to make its meaning. So as Drake continues, it's only on second viewing that the show's beauty, communicated by osmosis rather than apprehension, begins to set in. In time, it's the sum of the disparate parts that works. In time, we realise that our own frustrations notwithstanding, this is a breakthrough for the artist. Drake's repetition of the qualifier in time conveys Massumi's backward referral in time at work on a spectator. The immediate impact takes on meaning as it is processed cerebrally after the event. I've cut a large example here because we haven't got time, but I have an example in the article about how he staged a monologue and used sort of a whole tap dancing chorus line to punctuate it, along with a live cello punctuating it, along with, butthole surfers playing it, ear crunching volume and all the rest of it. And then those moments of stillness and silence that came out of that. So Abdo's is a dramaturgy of repetition, juxtaposition, acceleration, simultaneity, and above all, accumulation, layer upon layer of text, music, sound effect, gesture, dance, all adding up to a series of affective climaxes. Above all, when I look at the script now, I can still hear the way actors delivered certain lines and how the punctuation of the cello or the tension building of the recorded music was used to create a nervousness in the body and a sense that the whole theatre would explode along with Hilda's bone. In this way, the composition of the performance text works on the spectator far beyond the reach of the signifying qualities of the spoken text. And it is this that allows Abdo and Bogeyman to respond to HIV/AIDS and its discourses in a dramaturgy that, while it may not be instantly recognisable as political theatre, Nicolas Muller-Schul would describe as theatre done in a political way, by questioning the frame, questioning theatre as such. John Bell argues that the arrival of AIDS produced a move away from an American postmodern theatre that had been politically disengaged since the end of the Vietnam War. The AIDS epidemic changed the nature of avant-garde performance irrevocably, he says, forcing artists to consider and analyse not only the horror of the killing disease, but the social and political implications of government and corporate responses to the epidemic, as well as questions of homophobia and racism inevitably linked with the AIDS crisis. Roman concurs, arguing that the driving force behind performances and plays by AIDS may be neither rage nor remembrance, as some critics argue, but the attempt to intervene in a dominant AIDS ideology as it takes shape and is sustained instead. In fact, there was definitely rage driving Abdo's work, a point made repeatedly in reviews and critical analyses, but he himself notes that anger acts as an agent that propels you to take action. Abdo channeled his rage to do exactly what Thompson is calling for now, to produce a cultural riposte to the hegemonic discourses of AIDS that prevailed at that point in time. Thus, Bell posits Abdo's work as a brilliant theatrical response to what Simon Watney has called the spectacle of AIDS. Watney's argument was that this didactic spectacle, performed through the European and North American mass media and AIDS education, expunged the diseased bodies of gay men in order to shore up the patriarchal family. In this analysis, the diseased gay body is seen not only to threaten other normative bodies, but also metaphorically threaten state, family, and society. Abdo's post-HIV positive plays resolutely staged the diseased gay body, using his queer dramaturgy to tackle neoliberal discourses of AIDS governance. The dramaturgy is queer rather than gay because it moves from an identity politics of representation to a resistance to dominant theatrical notions of character and plot development that tend to fix visions and that's Selena Busby and Central Steve Barrios article. As Gupta notes, Abdo was not one to search after fixed identities. Rather, the open and fluid form resists both normative dramaturgical frameworks and normative discourses of ideology and power. In his experiential queer dramaturgy, Abdo staged gay HIV/AIDS subjectivities without normalizing, without de-gaying, and without apology. I know this is a ridiculous picture. Why couldn't find one with eyes and man who superposed himself? I don't know. Anyway, Roman argues that the discourses of the late 1980s and early 1990s, resolutely about AIDS, gave way to what was called the end of AIDS discourse. Emerging from medical advances in the treatment of HIV/AIDS, this discourse produced an understanding of AIDS as a manageable condition rather than a terminal one. These advances in turn produced a lack of media interest in AIDS and calls from gay figures for post-AIDS identities and cultures. This is a highly problematic position, firstly because a scholarship dealing with the discursive construction of the end of AIDS has shown it's ensconced in issues of race, class and access. Secondly, as noted, it has produced a cultural climate in both mainstream and LGBT media that has to a very large extent occluded HIV/AIDS from public discourse and representation, beyond discussion of HIV and AIDS in other countries, the other countries. Roman argues the social, cultural and medical problems that structure this moment in AIDS history have been rendered invisible by this discourse. This invisibility is supported by the gay and lesbian media, which have positioned marriage and the military as the two main political sites of the late 1990s at the expense of AIDS. As noted, this focus is predicated on producing desirable post-AIDS identities through the strategy of distancing gay subjectivity from AIDS and anything that marks the LGBT community as non-normative and unhealthy. Duggan notes that alongside radical and progressive AIDS activism, a new strain of gay moralism appeared, attacks on promiscuity and the gay lifestyle, accompanied advocacy of monogamous marriage as a responsible disease prevention strategy. Taking Patton's term de-gaying beyond the context of mid-1980s AIDS education's attempts to reduce the homophobia surrounding AIDS, the longer-term result, arguably, has been an LGBT community that has de-gayed itself. Reading Roman alongside Tomso, it's sobering to realise that in the decades since the former wrote his piece, and the almost 2 decades since Bogeyman, the normalising focus on marriage and family appears to have increased, if anything. As Philpott puts it in Bison, things are different now gays gone mainstream. Gays on Big Brother, sitcoms and shit. Rainbow flags everywhere. People like gays. Gays are funny. At the same time, the undesirable gay HIV/AIDS subjectivity has been ushered away out of sight along with the other bad queers. In terms of AIDS discourses and governance, this is evidenced in what Thompson formulates as a new wave of conservative backlash against those infected with HIV. A neoliberal exhortation to take personal responsibility in managing one's HIV serostatus now competes with older public health approaches that look to the state rather than to the individual to stem the tide of the pandemic. That was Thompson. Roman argues for the continued need for AIDS performance, while acknowledging that this is problematic if contemporary culture is not about AIDS. If this was true in 2000, it is, as Thompson argues, as pressing now, when it is clear that in very real terms, according to HIV/AIDS statistics, contemporary Western society is still about AIDS, though apparently only one day a year when we get some new kind of updates about what we're at, and last week's were no different. It's getting worse, and the numbers are rising in Western societies. So, according to the Avert website, and this was last year, 2010 actually, there is mounting evidence that prevention activities in several high-income countries are not keeping pace with the spread of HIV, and in some places are falling behind. Roman notes Michelangelo Signorilo's warning that we are headed towards an unqualified disaster in which a new generation of gay men become as immersed in the horrors of AIDS, disease and death as previous generations. A disaster Roman puts down to the message and belief that AIDS is over. This new generation is also identified by anthropologist Benjamin Young, who outlines 3 generations of gay men. So firstly, those who watched their peers die and subsequently have been processing the idea that they survived despite years of sexual activity without HIV seroconversion. A second cohort who came of age subsequent to the installation of safer sex as the guiding principle of HIV prevention, and to whom condoms were normative, and I'd say the ones that saw those ads are probably my generation, a lot of us. And finally, emerging in the mid-1990s, a third cohort of young gay men who had little or no personal experience with AIDS. It's this third generation and the one that will follow it that is clearly most at risk from the cultural absence of HIV/AIDS representation. Current statistics indicate that in recent years there's been a significant increase in new infections among men who have sex with men, MSM, in higher income countries. Johnson notes that the failure of current prevention activities can be traced to what he calls the obvious limit of the one-size-fits-all HIV prevention mantra, use a condom every time. He says the supposedly rational subject of HIV prevention, who dutifully and routinely adheres to safe-sex practices after learning the roots of HIV transmission, has not fully materialised. Successful treatments have raised new ethical and epidemiological questions, and the very act of survival in the midst of the pandemic has led to new sexual identities, such as barebackers, new valuations of life and health, and new modes of subjectivity. This vastly more complex understanding of gay HIV/AIDS subjectivity is difficult but vital for contemporary performance to engage with, and requires a new fearlessness in resisting the urge to present yet more easily consumed, funny, pretty gays. Indeed, there's still a deliberate resistance to dealing with it in new gay plays, as this article in the New York Times from last year attests. And they wrote, a new breed of plays and musicals this season is presenting gay characters in love stories, replacing the direct political messages of 1980s and 90s shows like The Normal Heart and Angels in America, with more personal appeals for social progress. The combination of a desire to normalise gay life and rightly to move AIDS discourse away from the gay disease to a universal pandemic has produced a mainstream/gay-stream cultural output which is reluctant to reflect the plurality of emerging gay sexualities. Evidence of increasing engagement in unsafe sex habits and contemporary theorisations of the complexities of economies of pleasure and risk mark a new moment that demands precisely a more directly political representation of embodied gay life that refuses to conform to the myth that we in the West are indeed post-AIDS. Bringing this argument to the UK, while some performance artists have insistently kept HIV/AIDS on the agenda in non-mainstream venues such as David Hoyle at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, for example, in London, in a non-urban conservative environment such as Northern Ireland, this type of subcultural performance is extremely rare, compounding a lack of mainstream or even fringe theatre representation of gay subjectivities of any kind. In 2007, the Outburst Queer Arts Festival in Belfast was established precisely in response to this absence, not only in theatre but across the arts. Deciding to stage Philpott's Bison in Northern Ireland then was a direct response to the absence of a plurality of gay subjectivities on the Northern Irish stage, and made more urgent obviously by Robinson's homophobic comments. Less publicly sensational, but what became clear while working on the play is that there has been a political failure of the power-sharing executive of the devolved legislature of Northern Ireland to deal with the issue of HIV/AIDS. They just hate talking about it, so they just don't. While the latest statistics from the Public Health Agency document that the number of people in Northern Ireland living with HIV has quadrupled over the past decade, there has been little public discussion of HIV/AIDS, whether in political, social or cultural fields. The statistics on homophobia also illustrate Northern Irish conservatism powerfully, with 23% of people confirming in a 2008 poll for the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland that they would have a problem with a gay, lesbian or bisexual person. So this context was the backdrop for the Belfast production of Bison, and it's fair to say, as I pointed out, that range played a part. I directed Bison with the playwright in its first incarnation in 2000, and true to Roman's, and this is a picture from Melbourne actually, true to Roman's chronology of AIDS discourses, the first version was definitely not about AIDS. Autobiographical and written in the wake of the end of Philpott's first serious relationship, it conveyed a highly personal experience of the anonymity of gay male sex and the desire for love and fulfillment. The original version of Bison engaged poignantly and humorously with the herd-like repetitions and patterns of gay male experience, by way of a central protagonist's attempts to negotiate this, and no characters were named in it. There was an S and then 1 to 6, and they fluidly moved around. I would say it didn't come straight to any overtly political stance at that point. It was very personal, very abstract kind of dramaturgy. However, when Lockwood came to rewrite the play for 2009, he noted 5 major areas he wanted to explore, given the changes he perceived in gay lifestyle over the decade. And those were the racism and the ageism of the subculture, the shift imposed by technology and virtual sex, the culture of not committing, the generic nature of the global gay scene, and most prominently, the forgetting that has occurred about HIV. So in an email conversation that we were having, he said, out of sight, out of mind it seems, and so everyone goes and fucks bareback and thinks it's okay. My feeling is that it is like some huge unspoken suicide mission of the next generation because common sense has been thrown aside for a hedonistic lifestyle and the assumption that PEP will save them, and if that doesn't work, it hardly matters anyway because nobody gets undulations and dies from it anyway. He doesn't really use any more punctuation in his plays, I have to say. So he's pretty clear about his stance on this. Echoing Signorile, Philpott is adamant that amongst the younger gay demographic, HIV/AIDS is regarded with a dangerous collective amnesia that runs counter to the actual rates of HIV infection in Western societies. The figure of young, newly out Jason in the play personifies this forgetfulness when, in a conversational exchange with an older man, as one reviewer put it, he samples the word AIDS like he's trying to recollect some fact from his history GCSE exam. The current script of Bison attempts to represent the complex subjectivities Thompson delineates in terms of unsafe sex, risk and pleasure, while not underestimating that there are whole sets of problems to do with identifying, representing and treating human subjects of HIV/AIDS. This is addressed through Philpott's complex non-linear dramaturgy that, although aesthetically very different from Abdo's, shares a clear resistance to fixing identity. Thus, while there are 4 named characters in this version, each embodied by a different member of the cast, and who do sometimes have straightforward dialogue with another character or deliver monologues in that role, the performers spend more time functioning as a chorus, whereas other figures who populate this gay time or verbally describing the scene unfolding in what I've called Philpott's scene-setting voice, and uses sort of a narrative voice quite frequently as a device. Yes. No, he does. It's very much part of his style and his way of creating theatre. And people complain about it. So lots of dramatists complain that, you have to show. Theatre's all about showing, not telling. And it does create some difficulties when you've got something explained, you can't show it. But I think it works very, very well. This plurality and fluidity of roles resists mainstream attempts to fix and render transparent the identity of the person with HIV/AIDS. Aesthetically, rather than simultaneity and assault of overload, Philpott's emphasis falls on the affective impact of the materiality of language, and his strength is in the orchestration of voices and wordplay. In staging, this linguistic corporeality tests the materiality of the stage, forcing the creation of an open, unfixed space that can move with the same fluidity and pace as the spoken words. Described scenes do not need to be duplicated visually. What they do need is to appear and disappear in an instant with a change of light, or a particular placement on stage, or a gesture or something to indicate that suddenly we're somewhere new, but the language is doing that for us really mostly anyway. Within this labile structure, Thompson's call for a renewed attention to sexual subjectivity vis-a-vis HIV/AIDS is embodied in the figure of Simon. Despite Philpott's clear personal frustration at practices of unsafe sex, coming as he does from that middle generation, he creates in Simon a complex picture of gay male sexual desire and subjectivity. This is conveyed in the imagery of Simon walking a metaphorical tightrope of unsafe sex in a porno-land circus of gay porn and ready sex. So it's a moment when it's sort of this very barren star stage suddenly goes all pink and glittery and becomes this lovely tightrope-y type thing, and you have to find some sort of physicality to do that. I've cut this text as well, but hopefully we'll get a sense of it. So sometimes, you'll see S up here for Simon in this case, but quite often that is 1. So the actor playing S is number 1. So Simon says, let's go somewhere. Right, where? Somewhere we can go a bit further. You know what I want to do. You pause. It's showtime in the big top. You pause, right? A syringe and a mask, a hose and a slap. Pause. Are you? A big wide smile like an animal trap. Yeah. And so what I'd argue with this is that we see the complicated structure of Philpott's dramaturgy. At one level there's the dialogue in real time between 2 men, S and 3. However, this is intricate with voices 2 and 4 narrating both Simon's internal desire and kind of confusion, and setting up the imaginary scene using the metaphor of the tightrope walker and the porno-land circus that's been set up. And I think this creates a dramaturgy of suspension or delay. It sort of stalls moment and stretches them out. Effectively, this moment works in performance by building up layers of voice through overlapping and chorus, supported by visual and sonic realization of the metaphor with lighting, sound and movement. As with Abdo's work, this resists the more clearly emotional or empathetic device of a realist dialogue, the usual dramaturgical architecture of political theatre. Like Abdo's, the politics is in the experience of that moment in the theatre. Simon's monologue is the most confronting scene in the play, dealing with his desires for violent, risky sex and his disregard for the consequences of this sex. I put it out that I wasn't going to read it because I think we're a bit short of time. Well, actually, I'm nearly finished. Shall I read it? I'll read the end, actually. I'll read the beginning.
Plenty of time.
Oh, things crashing, but I don't feel them. Things crashing, but when they smash, I can't feel them hit my skin. The blood looks pretty as it drips in a puddle on the floor below. And finally, I make you pull it out and stand up dizzy. That puddle of blood, pretty as if it's what? That blood dripping from inside me. What? As if it's what? This is as far as we've gone, but we keep going. And so it goes on in this vein. So perhaps, I think in Simon, this sexual subjectivity makes such an impact in performance because in portraying a desire for dangerous sex, Simon embodies on stage the lack of rationality that Tomka indicates in the complexity of identifying a single universal HIV/AIDS subjectivity. It raises questions in individual spectators about moral judgments and ethical concerns, placing the ideologies of public discourses of HIV/AIDS governance into stark relief. It highlights the very potent and ambivalent feelings about personal responsibility both the playwright and I assume members of the audience, share. Simon's long graphic monologue also exemplifies Thompson's insistence on being heard as we express our ongoing struggles with loss and survival, even if, especially if, what we have to say strikes others as repugnant or distasteful. Simon, and in different ways the other figures in Bison, do not fill the neoliberal profile or reproduce representations of a desirable, commercially viable gay. In a period when homonormativity is inscribed as a liberatory strategy, Philpott critiques notions of an homogeneous, unitary gay male sexuality/subjectivity and offers ultimately a queer world in which the subjectivity staged are imperfect, multiple, conflicted and endlessly shifting. As in Abdo's stage world, HIV/AIDS is part of gay experience, and the play insists that we do not separate the two. So, if in the moment of Bogeyman, Abdo refused to de-gay HIV/AIDS, with Bison, perhaps Philpott re-gays HIV/AIDS discourses by suggesting to contemporary audiences that HIV/AIDS is not separate from gay experience, no matter how necessary it's once been to provide this separation. Philpott assumes that theatre can provoke a more complex discussion than the whiting out of sexual subjectivities that fall outside of the hetero-homonormative matrix, and in doing so responds to Tom's plea for new cultural provocations in a post-AIDS economy. Not to do so is to be complicit in creating another generation living the lie that AIDS is history. If he struggles with the younger generation's forgetfulness of HIV/AIDS and its legacies, Philpott's queer dramaturgical strategies, like Abdo's, ensure that he does not offer solutions in the form of an idealized, fixed, in both senses, gay masculinity. While it seems somehow contradictory to want to raise awareness of the presence and dangers of HIV/AIDS and yet stage ambiguous sexual subjectivities, it's imperative to avoid the same old representational economies of good gays and bad queers. Philpott's updated version of Bison is angrier, more clearly political in thrust, yet retains the elliptical and fluid style that is as much part of it doing theatre in a political way as Abdo's assaultive dramaturgy. With his own queer dramaturgy, Philpott is able to reignite Abdo's cause and bring an unsettling but urgently timely reimagining of gay subjectivities onto the stage. So I finished the excerpt, I will add a little postscript, which is that since this, there has been a fabulous new play in Ireland called The Year of Magical Monkey by Neil Watkins, and he's an HIV positive performer. It's a one-man show, Italian verse, quite amazing piece of staging, and so probably that's where I'd like to go next with this. It's right about it, but probably also alongside Pete Edwards' piece Fat. Pete Edwards is a gay man with cerebral palsy, and it's very interesting to see what happens when you bring that to a queer arts festival and watch the lovely gay men run in droves from it and don't want to know. And so probably using queer as crypt theory and Margaret Childrick's idea of like the contingently able-bodied and contingent able-bodiedness and read those together. And then after that I'm going to write about women.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Are there any questions or comments, for instance?
Question, is there a copy of the script of Bison in the library?
Oh, I don't know if it's in the library, but it's here, look. It was very exciting, actually, because it was the first script that Lachlan had published. And I will try to make sure it goes into the library. It's a shame we really ignore it back here. No, I don't think, but yes, I will see if we can get that put into the library, but I'm happy to lend it as well. And it's interesting because I had to write the introduction, and then it was like, well, I don't know how. I can't believe actually there's a final version of this that's going into print, because I personally worked on 4 different versions, and you know, it changes. Lachlan is a writer that rewrites continually throughout everything. So I made this comment, and then laughed because we've been looking at another one that we might do in ensemble, and I laughed because there was a reference back saying, oh, I thought Lachlan was just doing this to annoy me, rewriting constantly, but I read that he does it all the time. So so there is a copy, but God knows what it would be, you know, what it would be now. And it's interesting because we were working on that at the same time as we were doing the production in Northern Ireland, and the other article is all about this process of transcultural translation, and you've all these issues of, right, well, we'll take out all the Australian bits, so all the, you know, the gum trees and the biting ants and all that go, and the, you know, blazing hot sun. Actually, I've got a great picture of the sort of the scene of Mardi Gras in Sydney, you know, it's hot, sweaty, and all the language, you know, all this hot, sweaty boys in this, you know, all the sweat and everything, and like, you're doing it in November in Northern Oh, okay, right, what do you think? So there's the kind of those geographical and linguistic and meteorological flora and fauna things that you're changing. But you're also whether if you put Northern Irish ones in, is that going to end up in this script and become something kind of weird? So it was a funny, sorry, that was a very long answer to that question. It's not in the library yet, but we'll get to it.
How did the production, how was it received in Northern Ireland?
Well, that's really what I deal with more in that other article, because in fact what I'm arguing, and it was only a tiny, you know, it was a studio, well, it was a lovely production.